Before I begin, I actually want to give a shout out to an awesome YouTube channel, and the channel name is Hello Future Me. It makes really great videos about fantasy in general, but also kind of diving into certain fantasy tropes, writing advice, and also kind of summaries and analysis of popular fantasy shows. Brilliant YouTube channel, got a really cool video on dragons, because you know I love dragons. So yeah, please do go check him out, and now we'll get to this episode. Greetings, I'm Shad, and I love fantasy. Like, it doesn't matter what fantasy, and you know, if it's got good characters in a wonderful, imaginative setting, I will get sucked in and I love it. And so I've loved fantasy my whole life, and through that course of time, there have been some interesting things that, in a broad sense, not every fantasy falls into these areas, but broadly speaking, many fantasy properties, whatever they are, get these simple facts and interpretations of historical weapons completely wrong. Now, I've addressed actually a lot of these different kind of points that I'll be bringing up in this video in separate videos, where I'll mention how they get swords wrong in one video, and I'll mention the axes in another video, and bows in another video, and things like that. And I want to compile all that information into one concise video that can kind of be shared to help inform people and stuff about, okay, if you're going to be dealing with medieval historical kind of weapons, or even fantasy interpretations of them, these are the facts in regards to how they operate in reality. And if you want to be more realistic, might be good to try and pay attention to some of these things and avoid some, honestly, the tropes that have been established that have they're there for fantasy. So I'll start with swords, what fantasy properties in general get wrong about swords. And this is from Dungeons & Dragons to even Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archives, okay? One of the biggest mistakes that they make is misidentifying them. Now, it's interesting how words work. I do generally ascribe to the fact that you use the words that most people kind of understand and comprehend with, but when it's a pretty big divide where most people actually know the subject have a word that is the proper definition, and then the larger kind of misinformed people are using the incorrect one, I think we can still try and correct it unless it becomes so standard and common that the definitions actually change in regular usage. The difficult one is broadsword, okay? Because broadsword has been misidentified so much to the point when you say broadsword, people generally understand what you mean unless you're a medieval enthusiast, and also a sword enthusiast, because a broadsword isn't actually a medieval weapon. It refers to a basket-hilted broadsword, but I have to mention it as a basket-hilted broadsword because people so often think of a medieval arming sword. Now, if you say a medieval broadsword, nearly everyone, even sword enthusiasts like myself, will know that they're referring to an arming sword because the broadsword isn't a medieval weapon. And so if you're adding that prefix, medieval broadsword, it's actually kind of an accurate enough term in the sense that it is identifying the correct sword. It's just that's not what they were called, and arming swords aren't particularly broader than other types of swords, so it's a bit confusing in that regard, but it is conveying a type of sword that you do know what they mean when people say it. The one that they really get wrong is longsword, okay? Longsword is identified in, say, Dungeons & Dragons, and even Brandon says, I think it's even Game of Thrones. George R. R. Martin, first Game of Thrones. Well, first book is Game of Thrones. It's the Song of Ice and Fire series. Longswords are mentioned quite early in the first book of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, but nothing is identified if it's two-handed or one-handed. So I can't really say, but I expect that is probably referring to arming sword because that's the trope. But then, having said that, old George, he does his research when it comes to medieval stuff, like Hedge Knight, one of the greatest. I haven't actually read the short story, just the comic book, the graphic novel, and it's just phenomenal. And I have the research and how he incorporates traditional medieval heraldry and all that beautiful, the stuff about knights and valor and all. So good. So good. That's why it's one of my favorite. Yeah, so maybe actually George was doing the right definition of longsword, but generally, longsword is misidentified in many fantasies as a one-handed medieval cruciform sword. That's incorrect, okay? That is what is an arming sword. An actual longsword is a two-handed... I got it right here. Actual longsword. There's a longsword. The standard two-handed medieval sword, okay? It's not a great sword. Great swords are even bigger, usually up to your armpit or taller. The actual crossover point that gets a bit grey between the difference between a longsword and great sword. I made a whole video. It's an old video, still a good one, when a longsword becomes a great sword. But no, longsword, two-handed weapon. And the other thing that people generally get wrong about longswords is their contextual use in combat. People generally think that longswords are the primary battlefield weapon. And credit to Brandon Sanderson, in the most recent Stormlight Archives Oathbringer, there's some flashbacks where the character Dalinar, this is when he uses a longsword. I think he actually reverts to using a polearm at one point to cave in someone's breastplate by just beating down on it. That's great, okay? Good to see. See, that's awesome. That's when you see weapons used in the correct historical context and it's more engaging and visceral and stuff like that. Because swords, they on the battlefield, yes, they were used, but rarely as primary battlefield weapons, and it depends the period in which you use, okay? If you go to the, say, Viking type period and everything like that, or because just Anglo-Saxons and stuff, even the Normans before the Battle of Hastings and all the things, if you go, they're all using the same kind of weapons and stuff. The sword was a bit more prestigious around there, and you would see them less on the battlefield, but more often in later periods where armor advanced and swords become less effective. And in those situations, you're going to see the average soldier using polearms, the billhook being a popular one for the average guy, halberds or poleaxes by knights in armor and stuff like that, and the sword is a backup weapon. The realm in which swords are primarily used in medieval combat is, of course, self-defense. Okay, they're convenient to carry around, they're very versatile, and so swords are brilliant in that regard. Now, of course, if you have a fantasy thing that changes the mix in ways swords are used, like shard blades in Stormlight Archives and things like that, or the Koloss swords in Mistborn, or there are just other magical swords, well, swords' context in how they're used in fantasy can actually be changed even a bit more, and if you can justify it logically, their use in mainstream warfare and combat could be far more prominent than they were historically. They were prominent historically, but as a backup weapon and as a weapon for self-defense. The other thing fantasies often get wrong about weapons is how effective they are against certain types of armor, okay? The sword is going to have a pretty hard time getting through leather armor. Leather armor is far... I made a whole video on the prevalence of leather armor. Well, it was in fantasy role-playing games. It applies to fantasy generally as well. A sword is going to have a lot of difficulty getting through leather, and if you want to know the prevalency of leather, watch my videos on leather. And even Gambison is going to be difficult as well, okay? Their use needs to be adapted for the armor that they're being used against. And so if if the main character has a sword and you're facing someone with full plate armor, you're going to... bashing on them will do nothing, okay? You're going to need a half sword. You're going to need to do a murder strike or strike with the pummel, you know, end them rightly and stuff to try and defeat this person in heavy armor if you only have a sword. So these are the more general mistakes that people make with swords, but I could make a whole video on it, really. I'm trying to keep this a more general overview on different weapons because, like I said, I've covered a lot of this subject in separate videos. I'm compiling it into one. And so we could talk about falchions, we could talk about katanas, we could talk about the advantages between one-handed and two-handed, the necessity for the shield, the type of way you'd want to fight with them when you're in armor compared to when you're out of armor, because these changes the way they fought with all things. And so if anyone's writing fantasy and if you're doing Dungeons & Dragons or anything like that, if you can learn about these things, I have other videos that cover many of these subjects, the deeper complex issues regarding all the things I've mentioned. It's great because it becomes more realistic, it's more engaging and stuff. So now I'm going to move on to axes. And the big thing that fantasy generally gets wrong with axes is these are not weapons that you would often want to use by themselves. Axes' defensive capacities are very limited. They have very little defensive ability. If you try and block with an axe, generally there's nothing protecting your hands and your hands can get chopped off, and so it's very difficult to use the axe in defense. You can hold it at the base and try and slap aside strikes and stuff, but that's difficult, okay? More often than not, an axe is a one-handed weapon. There are two-handed weapons. I'll get to two-handed weapons in a second, two-handed axes, but more often than not, one-handed ones always used with a shield. The shield gives you your defensive capacity because the axe offensively is devastating, okay? And if you can protect yourself while taking advantage of its offensive capacity, axes are brilliant. Historically, one-handed axe heads are far smaller than they're depicted in fantasy. Fantasy, they're massive because, you know, these really strong, powerful guys. So it depends on how realistic you want the fantasy depicted. If you've got something like Game of Thrones, which is a very grounded fantasy, having this incredibly oversized axe head is not going to be realistic. And what do I say when I mean oversized? Aha! My old God of War prop, okay? Now, interestingly, in regards to fantasy, an axe head this size is still a conservatively sized axe within fantasy. You can see axes just of insane size, all right? But even this one that is seemingly conservative is ridiculously oversized for a battle axe. There are a number of problems and issues regarding it. One, the handle is generally too long for a one-handed axe. A one-handed axe is probably the handle, stop there. It'll be here and stop about there, and the axe head is going to be much, much smaller. So it's going to cut off almost around there. Now, this is a oversized bearded axe. This, part here is considered the beard of the axe. And there are bearded axes that are a little bit bigger, but nowhere near as big as this. Historically, axes that were this big are actually like executioner axes, where the axe heads were so big that they'll chop off someone in one, clean strike. And so axes like this did exist, but they weren't battle axes, okay? Now, what's interesting about this, that the length of handle on a fantasy axe like this is too long to be a one-handed one, but for combat, it's also a bit too short to be a two-handed one. It's kind of in the middle. Now, I'm sure, of course, there are exceptions where you might have found a battle axe that this head is still way too big. It would be unwieldy if you had an axe head this big. But a small axe head with on a handle that was this long, yeah, okay, sure you can find them, but generally nowhere near this big. And this is all wood, okay? I actually have had some people think that this is metal, and so I take it as a compliment. I don't think it looks too realistic, but it has tricked some people. It's just painted wood, which is why I can hold it and swing it around so easily. If this was actually, steel, this would be very unwieldy because the axe head is so big. Now we come to double-bitted axes. They seem to be very common in fantasy everywhere. Now, of course, they did exist historically. There are wood-cutting axes that have double, now double-bitted means double-headed, okay? There's a blade on either side. Yes, and there are even some historical battle axes that were double-headed, but the thing you need to understand, these are more the exception than the norm, okay? There are kind of interesting issues that come with it, because when you're always going to be striking with one end, and axe heads can be, the other thing that I should really point out, historical axe heads, thin, okay? Battle axes, like these are not wood felling axes where you want a lot of weight to bite into the wood really heavily and you're not really worried about combat and recovering strikes and other things like that, okay? Combat axes, the axe heads, thin, all right? They were as heavy as you could get away with, but nowhere overly heavy where they become unwieldy, and they were able to manage that weight distribution by making those axe heads thin. And then going back to what I was saying before, you're only going to be striking with one end. And so even though these axe heads were thin, you're still essentially nearly doubling the weight. It's not a complete doubling of the weight because the actual central part, so it's like you're increasing it by 3/5. And that's not exactly necessary. These things are already heavy enough, generally as heavy, as I mentioned, as heavy as you could get away with. And so if you're going to increase the weight that much more significantly, it's going to hinder yourself in combat. It's going to be a detriment, not a benefit. So, and the other thing is, to make it more versatile, put a spike on the other end. Not nearly as heavy, okay? It actually increases the weight only marginally, and it gives you more options in regards to combat, okay? If you're coming up against some armor where you need to jam a spike through mail or something like that, well, of course, having a spike is more advantageous than having a double axe head in which you're not really going to be using much, okay? In my opinion, the ones that were made historically are a bit more for show, not for actual combat. If you were just, and of course, aesthetics actually were adopted historically in many circumstances, and some people would still use them in combat because they did want to fight and look cool and intimidate their enemies and all that stuff. But if you were just after plain utility, I think you would never go for a double-bitted axe. So that's my thoughts on the double-bitted axes. Now let's go to two-handed axes, because two-handed axes, the great axe, okay, that you see in fantasy, usually they're two-handed and they are double-bitted as well, like we see Gimli in Lord of the Rings, two-handed, all for battle. No. Two-handed axes did exist, okay, but the examples of them, of course, the axe heads are much smaller, far more conservative, and they're actually made with a lot of technical, intention behind their design. I'll give you a first example, the classic Dane axe. The real two-handed great axe, you could say, from history. They're never double-bitted, for one, okay? The axe heads are very, very thin, and then they kind of flare out towards the edge, so the angle of the edge can be a bit more robust, handle a bit more damage, and, get a good strike on it, all that stuff. But that's a lot of sophistication, okay, behind these designs. They're not just these hulkingly thick, insane, unliftable two-handed axes like you see in fantasy. One of the bigger culprits is the Dane axe from the video game For Honor. You see how thick that thing is? Oh my goodness. So axe heads, rarely double-bitted, always thinner, and the two-handed ones, I've never seen a double-bitted two-handed axe. They might exist. Link in the comments if you know one. I'd like to see it. Their shafts are usually much longer than what you'd see on say a wood felling axe, because these are pole arms, okay? And then if you go later on in history, the two-handed axe is what we would call the pole axe. People rarely consider it just a plain axe. We call it a pole arm, okay? This thing is a vicious thing. Of course, the halberd, okay? Any type of pole arm that has an axe head on it. Well, that's where you will find the two-handed battle axes of history. The actual two-handed double-bitted great axes, that's more a fantasy invention in reality. And if you're wanting your fantasy to be more realistic, the, you know, double-bitted great axe fantasy thing, yeah, you might want to get rid of it. The next weapon that I want to address, and by the way, I should have kind of mentioned this at the beginning, I'm going to be mentioning the more classic weapons you see, not the obscure ones, because there are very obscure ones that are still misrepresented in fantasy stuff. All right, the classic, the ones hitting this in a broad manner. And so the next weapon I want to address are, of course, warhammers, because fantasy warhammers compared to historical ones, wow, is there a difference, okay? So it's funny, I actually think that many fantasy warhammers are getting a bit confused between the difference between a warhammer and what is historically known as a maul, okay? A maul, which you can kind of call a warhammer in a sense, they have huge, you know, heads. That's because they're made out of wood, not metal, okay? So they have these huge hammer heads that are wood, and yeah, big swing and stuff like that. They existed historically, but in my opinion, they're not as effective as a true warhammer. And a true warhammer, the hammer heads are smaller. They're not Mjolnir, okay, like we see with Thor or anything like that. If you actually made Mjolnir real solid, be unliftable. In fact, Michael Cthulhu, which I love his videos, he made a warhammer from Warhammer, okay? It was used by one of the races in Warhammer. And so he made the real thing, and it wasn't like a Mjolnir-sized warhammer. It was just really hefty, and it was big and stuff like that, and he can barely lift it. This thing is insanely heavy. So warhammers, they were made as heavy as you could get away with, because weight is significant and it's going to add a lot of power, but as soon as you cross the line where they become unwieldy, that's too much. So as heavy as they can be, but as light as you can also get them to be effective and usable and functional. And in my opinion, these classic warhammers are much more effective than a maul, because a maul has a larger surface area and that disperses the force over that area, where a hammerhead, if a hammerhead is just, you know, about as big as a large coin, it's far broader than, say, the edge of a blade, okay? So the force is still dispersed, but that means it's not going to get stuck in everything, and it's very effective in transferring blunt force through armor and stuff. And so that's why they're very, very effective. But there's a difference, okay? Historically, there were never any warhammers that were made out of metal that had a huge hammerhead on the end. You can't lift them. It's too heavy, okay? Because that's what people do in fantasy. They usually give their characters warhammers, mauls that are made out of metal. Now, out of the shape, okay, you would never actually correctly identify a hammer that looks like this. That's got a huge head that's made out, even if it's made out of metal, you wouldn't call it a warhammer. That is a maul, all right? And a true warhammer is a true warhammer. So there we go. Those are warhammers. Next weapon, the bow. Bows and crossbows, actually. As I've mentioned before, I cover a lot of this information in just my video, Best Weapons for Women, okay? Because the bow has been misidentified to think that it suits people who have less strength. Regardless of women, just men who are also weaker than the average guy, the bow is good for them because you don't need much strength to use them, and you fight at a disadvantage. No. The bow requires a certain amount of strength to use effectively, especially the high-powered war bows. You need to be built to shoot those things, okay? When you get up to 150-pound draw weight in these things, yeah, and you see the strain when, like, the reenactors that use real war bows, the strain on their faces where they pull this thing and they're there. These things are heavy and they can't hold it for long, okay? They pull back, they'll probably zone in just a second or more and then let loose, because holding it for longer than that, my goodness, it's difficult. And so in actual fact, these war bows would suit big, muscly, burly characters so much more, not the, you know, kind of agile, graceful, weak characters, and they're often given to elves, and elves, depending on their strength, because, you know, how strong are elves? Sometimes they're stronger, sometimes they're weaker, but they don't look as strong because they're so graceful and slender usually. And no, big old war bows suit muscly, burly characters. And I'd love a fantasy that has like a Conan barbarian, hulking, beast of a character who uses a bow. Funny thing, the only time I've seen this portrayed accurately to even a small level of accuracy that a bow is a weapon for a muscular character is in one of the worst movies ever made, The Scorpion King. With the right, seriously. The Scorpion King has his favorite bow, and there's a part in the movie where the bow gets taken from him, and the bad guy's like, and this is his little bow, and he can't pull it back because the bow is actually properly made with sold full strength. And look, I'm going to spoil it because the movie sucks anyway, and you haven't watched it by this time, you're probably never going to watch it anyway. But he actually defeats the bad guy with this bow because this bow is so powerful, and only the Hulk. Oh, not the Hulk, the Rock. Only the Rock can pull it back, right? That this guy usually can block arrow shots and everything, but it's so powerful that the arrow is moving so fast, the bad guy can't block it and he dies to it like that. And so out of all the flaws in that movie, I like that part, okay? And I'd actually like this idea to be represented more in fantasy, that bows can be hugely, suit hulking, muscular, and they can be insanely powerful, proper war bows, okay? Because that's just cool, it's interesting. And it's a more accurate application of how bows can be used in fantasy. And of course, when it comes to crossbows are the perfect weapon for people who lack strength to be able to use heavy-powered war bows. Because crossbows can be deadly, okay? They suit, characters with less strength, whether they're male or female, so much more. But oftentimes, crossbows are given to either girls get the bows, guys get the crossbows. Don't know why. Maybe because they resemble God. I don't know. It's weird. And I should really give a shout out to Brandon Sanderson because in his Stormlight archives, he has a thing called shard bows, which are bows of such insane size and strength that only people wearing their special shard plate, which it gives enhanced superhuman strength to people, only they can use them. So shard bows are made for people who can use shard plate, and these things are insanely. It's basically a portable ballista, right? And the arrows they launch are these big, long shafted spears, essentially, and that's great. So Brandon, love your work. I love how you employed bows being a reflection of greater strength and stuff. It's all my archive. Good stuff. And those are the weapons that I did want to cover, okay? These are the broad ones compiled into one video, but there's still far more that we could talk on. So if you want me to address other weapons that are misrepresented in fantasy, share them in the comments below. If you want to share how they are misrepresented and I haven't covered anything, again, I want to read what your thoughts are. So do share them in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you for watching. And of course, I hope to see you again. So until that time, farewell.